The story begins in a world where many people possess magical abilities. We meet a girl named Nori, who has always felt different from the other children. But one day, something strange happened that changed her life forever. When she was 7 years old, she was looking out the window of her room, watching her neighbors, when she spotted a cat standing in the garden. At that exact moment, whiskers began to sprout on her face, and she transformed into an almost identical copy of that cat. Just then, her father walked into the room, and suddenly wings appeared on Nori's back. This was the moment Nori discovered her special gift. Fast forward 6 years. Now Nori and her best friend Reina were about to attend Sage Academy, the most renowned magical school in the country. Reina had the power to control fire. She was quite talented, but often held herself back because she lacked confidence. Nori, on the other hand, constantly reminded Reina that she could achieve anything she set her mind to. Still, Nori herself struggled with controlling her own powers. Whenever she transformed into an animal, she frequently ended up mixing 2 or 3 different creatures into a strange hybrid form. A few weeks later, Nori and Reina arrived at the bus stop along with the other kids, ready to catch the bus that would take them to Sage Academy. But just then, a peculiar man emerged from behind a tree, claiming he had come to escort all of them to their new magical school. The children said goodbye to their parents and followed him into the woods. After walking for a while, they found a portal that led straight to Sage Academy. Bud was the first to step inside, followed by Nori, Reina, and all the other students. The moment they arrived at school, they discovered that their phones no longer worked. Shortly afterward, the school's principal Linda appeared and announced that all the students would be sorted into 5 categories according to their abilities. The first group was the Fuzzies, which included children who could communicate with animals. Next were the Flickers, who could pull objects toward themselves with their hands. The third group was known as the Flares, who had the power of fire manipulation. The fourth group was called the Flyers, who could float or fly in the air. And the fifth group was the Fluxers, capable of taking on any animal's form. Before formal classes could begin, every student had to pass a test where the professors would assess their magic and place them in the appropriate groups. The Flares were tested first. They were given the task of lighting a candle positioned about 2 meters away. A boy named Philip went in first. After his test, Principal Linda handed him a card and asked him to wait outside. Later, when it was Elliot's turn, he couldn't light the candle at all. His hands produced smoke instead of sparks. The professors were visibly displeased. Finally, it was Reina's turn. She turned out to be the most impressive among her peers, igniting the candle with a mere flick of her little finger. Next came the Fuzzies' test. They had to converse with a dog and retrieve certain answers from it. If they understood all the dog's responses correctly, they would pass. The third test involved some students trying to pull a potted plant toward themselves with their powers. But when a girl named Paper had her turn, she accidentally pushed the planter away instead of pulling it. It slammed against the wall, resulting in her immediate rejection. Then came the flying test, where students were asked to remain 1 meter above the ground for 30 seconds. A boy named Andre took off his huge backpack before starting, and the moment he did, he zoomed upward and clung to the ceiling. He had no control over his power and couldn't manage to come down. It took the professors hauling a set of ladders to rescue him. Finally, it was time for Nori's group. Their test required them to transform into a cat identical to the one placed in front of them and maintain that form for 6 seconds. But when Nori's turn came, she managed to shift her appearance. And then, after barely 2 seconds, wings sprouted from her back, astonishing all the professors. Once again, Nori had lost control of her powers. After her test, she was given a card like all the other children and sent on her way. Once everyone had finished their tests, the students gathered in a big field where they were instructed to open their cards and find out which group they had been placed in. Reina discovered that she had been selected for the group of fire throwers, the Flares, and she was overjoyed. But when Nori looked at her own card, she saw that she was not in the Fluxers. Instead, the letters UDM were printed on her card. She had no idea what that group was. Principal Linda then directed the students to the cafeteria to collect their group uniforms, except Nori, who had to follow the path marked with a UDM sign. Nori said goodbye to Reina and took a wooded path leading to the UDM headquarters. Bud greeted her there and escorted her into an underground hall. When Nori entered the classroom, she met several other children who, like her, had failed the magical tests. These students were not taught any advanced magic. Instead, they had to study ordinary subjects, just like children without magical abilities. Hearing this, Nori grew angry and demanded to know why they couldn't learn magic, like everyone else. At that moment, Principal Linda arrived. She explained that UDM stood for upside-down magic. In other words, children whose magical powers weren't correct or considered useful in any way. Linda stated that such children would never master their magic properly, and that it was better for them to remain here, practicing normal studies until they forgot their powers altogether. Afterward, they could return to the regular world and study among ordinary students. She went on to reveal the reason for this rule, explaining that in the year 1989, a child named Regan Roberts had become a victim of shadow magic, a form of dark magic used solely for causing harm. Regan's power raged out of control until the professors and students joined forces to seal that magic into a secret tome. Shadow magic could not operate without possessing a human host. Linda further revealed that shadow magic always targeted UDM kids in particular. Hence, the Academy isolated these children and forbade them from using their powers, hoping they would forget magic entirely and thus avoid any risk of being possessed. That very day, all the newly placed students were sent off to classes with their respective groups. Raina learned that the annual Founders Day event was only a few weeks away. During this big celebration, 5 first-year students would have the chance to demonstrate their magic before the entire academy. Each professor would pick 2 of their best-performing students to compete, and the winner of that contest would get to perform at Founders Day. The Flair's Professor Ergen held the first session for her class. She tasked Raina with using her fire powers to turn kernels of corn into popcorn. Though Raina was nervous, she did fairly well until Philip started mocking her, which rattled her confidence and caused all the popcorn to burn. Witnessing this failure, Professor Ergen scolded Raina. At the same time, we noticed that a second-grade girl named Chandra was watching all of this from just outside the room, smiling to herself. The following morning, Bud took his UDM students into the garden, announcing he had a surprise for them. He opened the door to a small shed, revealing several brooms. Nori became excited, assuming they would learn to fly on them. But when she tried to mount a broom, she fell flat on the ground. As it turned out, these were just ordinary brooms, meant for cleaning up the school's garden. As Nori swept the garden, she moved near the area where other students were attending a class. She noticed a professor teaching them how to take the form of a specific type of cat. Nori overheard someone mention that on the upcoming annual Founders Day, a single student would get the opportunity to showcase their skill before the entire school. Hearing this sparked an idea in her mind. She resolved to practice her powers in secret, prove her magic to everyone, and finally persuade Linda to let her join the other students in regular magical training. Later, Nori sneaked near the class under some pretext, picked up a certain cat named BB in her arms, and studied the cat's every detail meticulously, determined to replicate its movements and mannerisms perfectly. Her goal was to transform into an identical cat in front of the whole school. But once again, she lost control of her abilities and turned into a bizarre creature composed of mismatched animal parts. Alarmed, the professor called Bud to restrain Nori before Principal Linda could find out, worried that Linda would be furious if she discovered what had happened. Later, at lunch in the cafeteria, Nori confided in her UDM classmates. She showed them a detailed sketch she had made of that cat, explaining that all she needed now was practice, so she could transform her body accurately. Meanwhile, Raina spotted Nori and started to approach her, only for Professor Ergen to stop her midway. Ergen reminded her that students from one group were not supposed to mingle freely with those from another. In the next class, Philip used his magic to produce popcorn again, pleasing the professor greatly. She declared him the best student in the session. As Raina was walking through the corridor to another class, Chandra suddenly approached her, praising her magical abilities. Before leaving, Chandra hinted that she could help Raina become even more powerful if she ever wanted additional training. Later, we see that Raina, eager to become the top magician in her class, was studying in the library late at night. While returning a book to the shelf, a pitch-black tome fell off by itself. When Raina bent down to pick it up, she discovered that it was a shadow magic manual. The instant she opened it, the lights went out, and she realized she had made a terrible mistake. She quickly shoved the book back onto the shelf, gathered her things, and hurried back to her room. But to her shock, the mysterious book seemed to follow her on its own. Meanwhile, back at her hostel, Nori was practicing her cat transformation with the other UDM kids. No matter how hard she tried, she kept combining multiple animal traits after 3 seconds. Wings, whiskers, horns, you name it. The next day, Raina looked out her window and saw Nori having a good time with her new friends, which made Raina feel somewhat sad. She assumed Nori had forgotten her. Then, out of nowhere, that shadow magic book magically reappeared, flipping its pages by itself and stopping on a chapter that showed a technique for unleashing one's hidden powers. The moment Reina started reading, a dark cloud materialized around her and dived straight into her body. A few hours later, all the first-year students were called to a hall to witness a mini-competition among 2 top-performing kids from each class. The winner would be chosen to display their powers at Founders Day. The Flares were up first, with Philip pitted against Reina. Convinced he would win effortlessly, Philip got ready, but Reina had already transformed the corn into perfect popcorn. Professor Ergen tasted it and was delighted. She declared Reina the champion of the Flares, granting her the chance to perform at the annual Founders Day. Right at that moment, Nori stepped into the hall. She announced that she had been practicing for days to refine her magic, requesting one final chance to prove herself. She promptly morphed into a cat. Professor Han began timing her, but after 4 seconds, Nori's back sprouted wings yet again, and she lost control of her powers. Terrified, she shifted wildly between multiple strange animal forms. Reina tried to calm her down, but ever since Reina had read the Shadow Magic Manual, her fire abilities had grown exponentially. She also lost control, forming a giant fireball that nearly consumed Nori, until Nori managed to revert to her normal self at the last possible moment. Reina apologized profusely, and Bud quickly rushed to help Nori. Principal Linda, witnessing all of this, scolded Bud severely, warning him to keep his students in check or risk losing his job. Upset and discouraged, Nori and her friends returned to the UDM headquarters. They felt hopeless, convinced they would never get to practice magic again. That's when we learned that many years ago, Bud had been in the very same position as them. He was a former UDM student himself. Feeling genuinely sorry for the kids, he gathered them in the forest and confessed that he, too, was tired of seeing UDM children's dreams wither away. Since he wasn't happy with his job, he decided to teach the kids how to embrace and harness their unique abilities. Suddenly, Bud began to sing in a language the forest animals could understand. A number of woodland creatures promptly appeared, revealing that Bud's ability was in the fuzzy category, though in an upside-down way. Instead of speaking normally to animals, he sang to communicate with them. In secret, he had been practicing his magic all along, so he wouldn't lose it entirely. He promised Nori and the other children that, starting the next morning, he would train them properly to master their special talents. Walking back afterward, Nori replayed the day's fiasco in her mind and realized something was off about Reina's magic. To find out the real cause, Nori decided she had to talk with Reina face to face. Meanwhile, when Reina reached her room, she found Chandra standing there with the Shadow Magic Tome. Chandra pointed out that thanks to this book, Reina's powers had skyrocketed. Horrified by the thought of nearly hurting her best friend, Reina demanded that Chandra leave her room. But once Chandra left, the book slipped back in on its own, drawn by some magical force. Angered, Reina opened the door, and there stood Nori. At once, Reina embraced her, but not wanting Nori to discover the truth about the Shadow Magic Manual, Reina hastily ushered her out of the room. Early the next day, Bud began the promised training session with his little team. First, he tied a hose around Andre's waist and encouraged him to hover at a steady height without floating away. Andre set aside his backpack and promptly soared upward again. Even so, he still couldn't bring himself down at will. But as training continued, the kids gradually learned to accept and even refine the special quirks of their powers. They no longer aspired to be standard magicians like everyone else. During these sessions, they also became close friends. Elliot discovered how to shape the smoke that emerged from his hands, while Paper learned to push things away with controlled force. Meanwhile, Nori stopped trying to become just one single animal and began experimenting with blending 3 or 4 creatures at once to create entirely new forms. Over on the other side, Reina was watching them have fun when Chandra appeared yet again. Reina shouted at Chandra to leave, but by now, the bond between Reina and the Shadow Magic book had been forged. She and that presence were effectively one. When the others asked Reina who she was yelling at, it became apparent that only Reina could see Chandra. Reina ran off to her room, but Chandra showed up once more, determined to draw out Reina's hidden potential. She told Reina, "Your magic is far stronger than that of any other child here." In the end, Reina gave in, allowing the dark magic to fully awaken her powers. She embraced the shadow magic path Chandra had been pushing her toward. Moments later, Nori arrived and noticed something ominous about Reina. She had clearly fallen under the influence of a malignant power. It turned out that the shadow magic did not exclusively target UDM kids, now overwhelmed by dark energy. Reina's voice took on a menacing tone as she declared, Before long, this entire school will be destroyed. Ha! If Nori cares about her life, she'd better run. Terrified, Nori rushed to Professor Bud and told him everything. The UDM group decided they should warn Principal Linda, but Bud said Linda would never believe them. He suspected the Dark Force would likely strike the following day, on the annual Founders' Day. When the morning of Founders' Day came, the students and faculty gathered in the garden. Linda invited Raina onto the stage to demonstrate her magic. At first, Raina sat in place, forming fiery letters in the air to greet everyone. Then she stood up, announcing she had prepared something special. Suddenly, she conjured an enormous ball of fire in her hands, and her shadow extended to cover the entire garden. From that shadow came an eerie voice. "I have returned after all these years." The professors instantly recognized it as the same entity that once possessed Regan Roberts. They realized now that shadow magic did not only hunt for UDM children. Determined to stop this evil presence from destroying everything, Professor Ergen teamed up with her students to launch an enormous fireball at the monster. But it was unfazed. Following Principal Linda's orders, the Fuzzies tried summoning animals to attack, but those creatures ran away in terror. The shapeshifters also attempted to fight back, but they transformed into animals incapable of doing serious harm to that monstrous force. One by one, everyone's hopes dimmed. Finally, the kids from UDM stepped forward. Paper concentrated her power and forcefully shoved the monster backward. Elliot conjured a wall of thick smoke to block its vision. Up above, Andre flew around to distract it. Meanwhile, Nori assumed a ferocious hybrid form, preparing to strike. Linda urged the children to unite, channeling their magic against the monster. But Nori urged everyone to keep their distance. She knew that behind this monstrous shape was her best friend, Raina. Risking her own life, Nori confronted the demon, so Raina could wrestle back control. The monster was about to finish Nori off when a sudden massive fireball erupted from inside it, consuming the beast on the spot. When the smoke cleared, Raina was finally free of the shadow magic. Relieved, Nori exhaled and threw her arms around her friend. In the end, the UDM children had collectively saved Sage Academy from destruction. From that day forward, the UDM program was abolished. Those students were now allowed to study their unique magic alongside everyone else. Bud, for his heroic efforts, was elevated to a full-fledged professor who would teach students how to communicate with animals in creative and unconventional ways. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel. See you in the next video.